on this episode of Postcards.
When I started this trip, I was at a point in my life where I wanted to try something big. I wanted to do something that no one's ever done before.
At the end of the trip, we had long stretches of isolation, and we had been on the trail for 6 or 7 months.
I think what I took away from this trip the most was how little you need to be happy.
This program on Pioneer Public Television is funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008. Additional support provided by Mark and Margaret Yakel-Julien in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. ShalomHillFarm.org. The Arrowwood Resort and Conference Center, your ideal choice for Minnesota resorts, offering luxury townhomes, 18 holes of golf, Darling Reflections Spa, Big Splash Water Park, and much more. Alexandria, Minnesota. Explore hundreds of lakes, trails, and attractions for a great vacation or a place to hold an event. ExploreAlex.com. Tri-State Brain and Spine Institute, with locations in Alexandria, Edina, Crookston, and Maple Grove. Doctors dedicated to evaluating and treating all types of brain and spine problems, no matter how complex.
Rediscover North America is an 8-month canoe expedition, and we started on January 2nd in the Gulf of Mexico, and we paddled north through the United States and through Canada, and we finished in the Arctic Ocean. And it was a 6-member team, and the trip was thought and an idea from Mitchell Delano, who had some previous paddling experience and had won Canoe and Kayaks Expedition of the Year, and he had a little grant money to do another trip, and that's how Rediscover North America started.
When I started this trip, I was at a point in my life where I wanted to try something big. I wanted to do something that no one's ever done before. And then Winchell sold this trip to me, and I was really excited about it. And before we started, a lot of people were telling me, like, why are you doing this? Like, it's not possible. Like, they would look at the map with me and say, you know, you're crazy. But we tried it anyways, and it was a lot of work, and we fought through, and we made it.
The first question is always why? Why go out and do something like this? And to be honest, that never really occurred to us. We just thought, hey, why not? I mean, what's wrong with adventure for the sake of adventure?
Let's go!
The second question is usually, well, how is that even possible? And that takes a bit longer to explain. It started simply with the idea to paddle across Canada, but that notion escalated quickly into a proposed 9-month odyssey. Prep work started in November of 2014 and lasted over a year and spanned across the country from Utah to Minnesota. 270 days worth of food and gear needed to be organized, which was no easy task. But by late December of 2015, we were finally ready to begin. So our plan early on was to paddle up the Chafalaya River, then onto the Mississippi north through Vicksburg, Memphis, St. Louis, Davenport, and eventually St. Paul, our hometown goal by mid-April. But before we set out, the crew got together in southern Louisiana to put the final touches on everything and then relax, something we thought would be in short supply for the coming months. And we got to enjoy some southern hospitality before setting up our first camp at Burns Point. That moment was pretty surreal, packing up our things the next day and loading the boats. Who knew how many times we'd repeat that process before we got to the Arctic Ocean? Those thoughts faded quickly as we paddled the shoreline of the bayou. Atchafalaya was like nothing we'd ever seen before. Spanish moss decorated these majestic cypress trees and formed the shorelines. Alligators sprawled on muddy banks and soaked in the winter sun. It was exactly the endless summer northerners project on the south, very easygoing. It took us only 8 days to paddle the 160 miles upstream before we reached the Mississippi River. As we portaged between the outflow and inflow channels, the new task at hand started to sink in. We were about to wake up to a whole different animal the next morning.
Goodbye, Atchafalaya. Hello, Mississippi.
The contrast was clear right away. Although we'd seen a few wing dikes before, on the Mississippi they were significantly more challenging. Now we were encountering 20, 30 a day instead of just 1 or 2. And given that paddling upstream naturally forces you to the shoreline, we had to either paddle out and around them, battle the intensified current, or carry the boats one by one across the jumbled piles of rocks that formed the dikes. It really came down to what you'd rather have, a sore back or sore arms.
4 of the 6 of us went to the same high school in St. Cloud, Cathedral High School. And I was the youngest. So Adam was 2 years older than me, and then John and Winchell are 2 years older than Adam. So we didn't really hang out all that much in high school, but afterwards, like our college years, we got together, and that's kind of where we all met and started our rap career.
We were having a great time living together and working together out in Utah, and we got Luke and Jared we were working with, we got them on board, and from there we had a great group of 6 guys who had, you know, wonderful outdoor skills, camping skills, and we really worked on our canoe skills as we went, and we had some great paddlers to start, so that's kind of how the crew aligned and got together.
We had arrived at our first resupply in Vicksburg exactly on schedule after only 2 weeks. In general, resupplies were short, only lasting 24 to 48 hours, and there was plenty of work to fill the days no matter how much effort we had put in before we left. There was no rest for the weary. The weather slowly deteriorated after Vicksburg. What had been nice, warm days interrupted by brief stints of rain or cold became predominantly cool with long, sustained showers that kept everything wet. Winter was on its way. New river features appeared as well. While there were always dikes and barges, shallows and sandbars began to force us out of our boats and into the water. As the temperatures got cooler, it became a warmer strategy to walk them through the shallows or drag them tethered from the shore. But it was not until we were saying goodbye to our second resupply in Memphis early February that the weather truly turned. Freezing conditions became the norm. Fires were routine in camp. The sand that formed the shoreline started to freeze. Ice even formed on the boats as we paddled. When 12 inches of snow fell in mid-February around southern Missouri, we knew winter had arrived in earnest. But the more serious concern was the plummeting temperatures. Below freezing weather started to keep us off the water. The schedule we kept so well began to stretch as we fell behind to the cold, the longest 5 days in St. Louis. It was early March before we saw consecutive days above freezing in the forecast again. We still moved when it was cold, but sometimes we had to be creative. The historic Portage des Sioux was a great example. Some extra river miles up the Missouri out of our way and a 2-mile portage gambit, all to avoid ice above Lock and Dam 26.
The plan was to get around the dam without having to do the portage down there, get in some miles further up the Mississippi, and hopefully avoid the ice. But we ran into a huge field of it. So now we will probably, once we finish the entire portage, have to pull on it. So.
Turns out we just couldn't outrun the ice.
For me, the most interesting part of the trip was meeting all the people along the way. There was so much hospitality, especially going up the Mississippi River. We met what's called Mississippi River Angels, and they would stop and give us food, let us use their laundry, showers. It was pretty amazing because we were just 6 dirtbags paddling up the Mississippi, and they wanted to meet us and spend time with us. So that was my favorite part.
So Appleton was a kind of a great story. When we arrived in Appleton, we had just finished, I believe it was the lower Minnesota River. We got to Lake Lacaparo, and the day that we got there, it was just rolling waves. So we got off the river and looked at the lake, and we knew we couldn't paddle. And at that very moment, right when we got our tent set up to just kind of relax and take a nap for the afternoon and wait for the wind to stop, Winchell had gotten an email from Joan and Barry, and they own Shooter's Bar, and she said, "Hey, I saw you on the news. I'd love to have you in, just if you guys want to come for a burger and hang out. We'd love to meet you while you're passing through our neck of the woods." So we said, "Yeah, great. We got nothing to do but hang out." So we went into Appleton that day. Joan and Barry were great, and members of the community came, and it was fun because I remember sitting there with computers, and they had pulled up Google Maps, and they said, "Here's going to be some tough spots coming up ahead," and kind of helped scout through the next few miles. And we had a couple rivers and lakes to go through at that time. So it was just very welcoming community. We ended up staying at their house, and the next day was terrible weather too, so we hung out in Appleton for the next day, and they fed us great meals. And still to this day, they're great friends of us. They came for the premiere of the film, and they're still in touch with us. So it was very welcoming to be in Appleton, and it's something that I know all of us will never forget. We had a great time at Shooters and a great time in Appleton.
After we finished the Mississippi, we traveled on to the Minnesota River. The current was pretty challenging on the Minnesota, so it made us work for it, that's for sure. We paddled up the Minnesota, and then we hit the Little Minnesota, and then we hit Browns Valley, which was a very exciting time for us because finally we'd be going downstream after we crossed the divide in Browns Valley.
Plans after the Mississippi got a little more complicated. More upstream on the Minnesota River before crossing the divide, then downstream on the Red River, flat water on Lake Winnipeg, until upstream again on the Saskatchewan, Sturgeon Weir, and Churchill Rivers before the trailhead of the Methy Portage. We welcomed the prospect of the Minnesota with open arms. It was exciting to be back on a smaller river, but smaller wasn't exactly easier. Flooding left the river riddled with fallen trees, not exactly the best obstacle to have in the water.
Yeah.
And as it continued to get steeper, rapids were more common, and we faced harder paddling and more portaging. But before we knew it, we were moving up the Little Minnesota, about to reach downstream for the first time at Browns Valley. A short 2-mile portage brought us to a small, unassuming campground at the south end of Lake Traverse. That was a particularly satisfying moment, smiling for photos at the divide with family and friends sharing in the moment. We got our just desserts pretty quick though. The dry conditions that helped to make upstream more manageable months prior turned downstream headwaters into a boneyard. Over a stretch of 30 miles on the Bois des Sioux, we spent more time walking our boats than paddling them. And low water on the Red River, it hardly resembled its normally flooded spring self. We had arrived to find a slow, muddy gauntlet instead. Despite all this, downstream was still downstream. Being able to take a break on the water and move in the right direction, that was something new. And rapids were fun again. Even the ones we couldn't shoot and had to line were enjoyable because it was an excuse to get out of the boats and cool off. But it's always better when you get to stay in the boats.
So we're just north of Wahpeton and Breckenridge, just started the Red River, and came across our first whitewater. And it looks like there is a nice little soft trough through the middle. We're gonna send a crash boat through and see what happens. The crash boat today will be manned by Dan Flynn and myself, and we'll see what happens.
The best part though was how far we could travel in a day. Our longest, over 65 miles that included some beautiful downtown scenery, put us just a couple days shy of Lake Winnipeg and signaled the end of downstream for the time being. After saying goodbye to our final lock and dam, it was time for a shift in gears.
At the end of the trip, we had long stretches of isolation, and we had been on the trail for 6 or 7 months. At times you were used to it, but also it was just a long time to be away from family and friends and the comforts of home. So I think a combination of both of those, the cold winter months to start, and then also just the fatigue of being away from family and friends at the end. Some of those stretches when we got up into the more remote parts of Canada were the most challenging.
I think what I took away from this trip the most was how little you need to be happy. All that we had with us, we could fit in our canoes, and yet we were having one of the best times of our lives. So, 2 pairs of pants, a couple shirts, just the food that you need to survive, and still having so much fun.
The remainder of the route was simple. Downstream on the Clearwater, Athabasca, and Slave Rivers to the eastern and northern shores of Great Slave Lake, and finally upstream on the Marion and Emile before paddling down the Parent and Coppermine rivers for the big finish at Kugluktuk.
Downstream. Whoop whoop. We made it.
All right.
The Clearwater was supposed to be our first glimpse at challenging downstream whitewater. But months of tough conditions upstream and low water levels throughout combined to make it a calm and quick affair.
Shaka, bro.
We had barely blinked before we were in Fort McMurray. And as we paddled out of the Snai 2 days later, the scale of the trip really started to kick in. Now on the Athabasca River, we continued at a swift and steady pace north through eastern Alberta, albeit accompanied by an abrupt return to lowland river features.
Lake Athabasca.
The Canadian Shield appeared briefly at Lake Athabasca near Fort Chippewa as the river takes its final turns before it meets the Peace and the two form the Slave.
That's a double.
Our only pause was the stretch between Fitzgerald and Fort Smith, an area known by whitewater enthusiasts all around the world. It was remarkable to see the sudden shift from calm, meandering river to the violent torrent it becomes. We were happy just to be in one piece at the other end. We arrived at the mouth of the river onto Great Slave Lake just a few days later, but were windbound in its meandering channels. Luckily, we found a cramped campsite and waited out the wind.
It's pretty windy, and we're taking a break. Brad Delano hooked us up with the weather report via the sat phone, and sounds like the hours of 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. are the best paddle hours for the day. So that's what we're gonna do. Taking a nap, resting the bodies. We'll take off here in about 6 hours.
Great Slave is an incredible area. Our time there was windy, but calm windows opened often enough for us to move daily, just on varied schedules. One last and lengthy resupply in Yellowknife was difficult to leave, regardless of how breathtaking the lake had been. We still had the northern shore to paddle and fewer islands to shelter us. Thankfully, warm weather and favorable winds lasted long enough for us to finish the lake in style. Upstream travel was hardly a daunting prospect at this point. We considered the Marion and Emile less of a challenge and more of a reward for all of our hard work.
Twerk, twerk, I like my.
Amidst all the great fishing and beautiful scenery, we had to keep reminding ourselves we were still in the midst of a long, grueling expedition and that the end was in sight.
Day 223. We're on the Emile River. We just made it under 500 miles to go to the Arctic Ocean. Big day. I remember when we were 500 miles in, thinking, what did I sign up for?
Under 500. Notice the slant of this hill. It's gonna help me actually. It's gonna help propel the boat.
And speaking of rewards, we were approaching the tundra, a landscape so barren and yet so beautiful. After a series of portages over the final divide at Mesa Lake, the trees disappeared and we were suddenly the tallest things around. It was also the point when the wind and the rain told us we were no longer welcome.
You know you can watch postcards on your TV, but did you also know you can watch postcards and other Pioneer shows anywhere, anytime using Pioneer On Demand at video.pioneer.org. This program on Pioneer Public Television is funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008. Additional support provided by Mark and Margaret Yakel-Julien in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. ShalomHillFarm.org. The Arrowwood Resort and Conference Center, your ideal choice for Minnesota resorts, offering luxury townhomes, 18 holes of golf, Darling Reflections Spa, Big Splash Water Park, and much more. Alexandria, Minnesota. Explore hundreds of lakes, trails, and attractions for a great vacation or a place to hold an event. ExploreAlex.com. Tri-State Brain and Spine Institute, with locations in Alexandria, Edina, Crookston, and Maple Grove. Doctors dedicated to evaluating and treating all types of brain and spine problems, no matter how complex.